Have you ever wondered why beds in old frontier houses were always so high off the floor? It wasn't a fashion statement or a carpenter's whim, but a harsh necessity in a world where cold killed more silently and quickly than bullets. In winter, temperatures on the Great Plains dropped so low that breath froze in the air, turning into icy dust before a person could even exhale. Pioneers who ventured west found themselves face to face with nature, which did not forgive mistakes and gave no second chances. Their houses were built of earth, their fuel was dry manure, and their survival depended on their ability to conserve every bit of heat. They turned their homes into complex thermoses using methods that would seem crazy or impossible to modern people. Watch the video to the end to find out how an ordinary potato could save a person's life on a frosty night and why snow was considered the best insulation for a roof. What if I told you that the most reliable shield against the deadly cold was the simple dirt beneath your feet? In the treeless expanses of Nebraska and Dakota, pioneers faced a shortage of timber for construction, so they turned their attention to the earth itself. They built houses out of sod, cutting bricks from the dense prairie soil, thickly intertwined with grass roots. These roots acted as reinforcement, holding the earth together and creating an incredibly strong structure. The walls of such a house were up to 1 meter thick, turning the dwelling into a kind of artificial cave or burrow. The earth had tremendous thermal inertia, slowly releasing the heat accumulated over the summer and keeping the icy wind out. The construction process resembled plowing a field rather than building a house in the usual sense of the word. Long strips of turf were cut with a special plow and then chopped into separate blocks weighing about 20 kilograms each. These blocks were laid with the grass facing down to create a tight bond between the rows and prevent drafts. The seams between the earthen bricks were carefully filled with loose soil or clay so as not to leave the slightest gap for drafts. Such a construction required enormous physical effort, but the result justified every hour of hard work. Inside such a house, even without intensive heating, the temperature rarely dropped below zero, which was a blessing. The windows in sod houses were small and few in number, as glass was expensive and let in too much precious heat. Window openings were often covered with oiled paper or ox bladders, which provided dim light but retained heat better than glass. Doors were made low and heavy, often hung with bison hides or old blankets on the inside for extra insulation. The ceiling was also covered with a layer of turf and earth, which lay on sparse wooden beams brought from afar. This heavy roof weighed down on the walls, compacting them even more and making the house a monolithic fortification against the elements. Inside the dugout, there was a special microclimate, which was characterized by high humidity, but a saving consistency of temperature. The walls were often whitewashed with lime, if it could be found, to make the room brighter and to secure the crumbling earth. The floor was simply compacted earth, which over time became as hard as concrete from constant walking. In winter, this floor was the coldest place in the house, so all life moved to the level above, closer to the ceiling. It was the thick earthen walls that made it possible to survive the blizzards, which could last for weeks and cover the plain with a layer of snow several meters thick. However, earthen houses had a downside that had to be put up with for the sake of survival. In the spring, when the snow began to melt, the roofs often leaked, turning the floor into a muddy mess and forcing the inhabitants to cover their beds with animal skins. But in winter, this moisture froze inside the walls, creating an additional barrier against wind and cold. People learned to live in symbiosis with the earth, realizing that it was their only protection from freezing to death. It was an architecture of despair and genius, born in conditions of absolute resource scarcity. Interestingly, even after it became possible to build wooden houses, many pioneers preferred to keep their dugouts as winter shelters. They knew that the thin plank walls of a frame house could not retain heat as effectively as a meter of compacted soil. Wooden houses were blown through by the wind and required a huge amount of fuel, which was simply not available on the plains. Dugouts, on the other hand, allowed people to save their meager supplies of dung and brushwood, preserving life with minimal energy consumption. It was a lesson in rationality that the frontier taught to anyone who wanted to stay here for a long time. Inside such a house, there was always the smell of earth and smoke, a smell that was absorbed into the clothes and skin of the settlers. But they associated this smell with the safety and warmth that was so lacking outside. They decorated their earthen burrows with carpets and fabrics, trying to create comfort in these harsh conditions. The walls were hung with newspapers, which served not only as decoration, but also as an indicator of the dryness of the air in the room. If the paper began to get damp and curl up, it meant that the stove needed to be heated more urgently. Life in a dugout required constant attention to the condition of the walls and roof, which could settle or erode. Every autumn, the owners checked the integrity of the turf and, if necessary, replaced the damaged blocks with new ones. It was an endless cycle of repairs and preparations for winter, on which the family's life depended. No one was too lazy to do this work, as the price of carelessness was measured in frostbite and illness. The dugout was a living organism that required care in exchange for protection. Even in the most severe frosts, when a blizzard raged outside, it was possible to sit inside the dugout without outer clothing. The heat from the hearth, reflected many times by the earthen walls, created an oasis of life in the middle of an icy desert. People gathered around the source of heat, repairing utensils or reading by the light of an oil lamp. These evenings in a cramped but warm circle became the basis of family traditions on the frontier. The dugout brought people together, forcing them to stay closer to each other physically and emotionally. Could you live through an entire winter in a house made of grass and mud for the sake of safety? Write about it in the comments. Ready to learn the truth about what romantic evenings by the fireplace in the Wild West really smelled like? There were no trees growing on the Great Plains, and the firewood that settlers were used to was an unaffordable luxury for most of them. They had to find an alternative source of energy, and they found it literally under their feet, in the tracks of huge herds of bison. Dried bison dung, called grass cakes or chips, became the main fuel of the frontier. Collecting this specific fuel was a daily chore that all available members of the community took part in. Bison chips burned slowly and evenly, giving off a surprising amount of heat when used correctly. They smoldered like peat, creating a steady heat that was ideal for heating dugouts and cooking food. The flame from this fuel was not bright. It was more like the glow of coals in a blacksmith's forge. The smell of the smoke was distinctive, grassy, and acrid. But one quickly got used to it and stopped noticing it. This smell permeated everything, becoming an integral part of the pioneers' daily life. In order to survive the winter, the family needed mountains of this fuel, prepared in advance during the dry summer months. Huge piles of chips were stacked near the house in the form of pyramids or high walls, trying to protect them from the rain. If the fuel got wet, it became useless, so its dryness was monitored as carefully as the flour supplies. Well-dried dung was light, almost like cardboard, and did not stain your hands when carried. It could be broken into pieces of the desired size to regulate the intensity of combustion in the hearth. When the bison became scarce, the settlers switched to collecting manure from their own livestock, which was also suitable for fuel. Cow manure was dried in the sun, turning it over with pitchforks for even drying. It was endless work that did not stop for a single day, as long as the weather permitted. In winter, when everything was covered with snow, every piece of dung found became a real treasure. People went out in search of fuel with sacks, walking for miles across the snow-covered steppe. Another invention born of desperation was the use of so-called twisted hay when grass became firewood. Using special hooks or simply their hands, bundles of stiff steppe grass were twisted into tight bundles resembling logs. These grass bundles burned very quickly, flaring up like gunpowder and providing only short-lived heat. To keep the fire going, it was necessary to continuously throw in new bundles without leaving the stove for a minute. This was called feeding the cat, as a stove with such fuel required constant attention. There were even special stoves designed for burning hay, with spring-loaded fuel feed mechanisms. They allowed the process to be somewhat automated and made the burning more even and longer lasting. But even with such devices, heating with grass was back-breaking work that exhausted people. The grass had to be mowed, dried, brought in, twisted, and then continuously fed into the furnace. Tons of hay flew up the chimney, barely managing to warm the air in the room. Everything that could burn was used: dry sunflower stalks, corn cobs, and even old oil-stained clothes. Corn cobs, by the way, burned very hot and fast, and were valued as an excellent fuel for quick cooking. But their supply was limited by the harvest, and there was never enough for the whole winter. People learned to combine different types of fuel, using chips for long-lasting heat and grass, and cobs for quick kindling. Fuel economy was elevated to an art form and a cardinal rule of life on the winter frontier. The stove was only lit when it was absolutely necessary for survival or cooking. The rest of the time, people relied on warm clothing and the insulation of their earthen dwellings. No one allowed themselves the luxury of keeping a fire going for beauty or comfort. Every spark counted. Fire was a tool for survival, not a decorative element. The lack of firewood even changed cooking habits, forcing people to give up dishes that required long cooking times. Food was cooked quickly, often in a single pot, to make the most efficient use of the heat from the scarce fuel. People learned to stew meat and vegetables using the residual heat of the stove after the main fire had burned out. Kizyak provided an even heat, which was perfect for baking flatbread and bread in closed cast iron pots. This dependence on manure and grass taught people humility and ingenuity in the face of nature. Which smell in the house do you think would be more unbearable for you? Constant cold or smoke from burning manure? Want to know a secret that will change your idea of comfort? A bed on the frontier was not just a piece of furniture for rest, but a complex engineering structure for preserving heat. It was a real house within a house, a microcosm where the temperature was significantly higher than in the rest of the room. Beds were built high, raising the sleeping area as far as possible from the icy earthen floor. Storage space was often arranged under the bed, creating an additional air cushion. The sleeping area was not based on the mattress we are familiar with, but on a tightly stretched net made of ropes. A so-called tick was placed on this net, a huge bag made of thick fabric, stuffed with straw or corn husks. This lower mattress provided insulation from below, blocking the cold air coming from the floor. The straw had to be regularly fluffed and replaced as it became compacted and lost its insulating properties. The rustling of straw under the sleeper was a familiar sound of the night in a pioneer's home. On top of the straw mattress was placed the main treasure, a down quilt, which was cherished like the apple of one's eye. The quilt was stuffed with goose or duck down and feathers, which created an incredibly warm and soft layer. A person literally sank into this quilt, and it enveloped their body on all sides, retaining the sleeper's own heat. Down was the best natural insulator available at the time, and its effectiveness had been proven over centuries. Collecting down for such a quilt could take several years, but the result was worth it. Sleepers were covered with heavy quilted blankets, sewn from scraps of old clothes and fabric. These patchwork quilts were not only a way to recycle old things, but also an important element of thermal insulation. Cotton wool or old wool was laid between the layers of fabric, creating a multi-layered cake that trapped warm air. Such a blanket was very heavy, pressing the person against the feather bed and creating an airtight cocoon. Heavy bison skins with the fur on the inside were often thrown over the blankets. Thick wool or flannel curtains were often hung around the bed, creating an enclosed space. These curtains completely isolated the sleeping area from the drafts that blew through the room at night. By drawing the curtains, it was possible to create a small capsule inside, heated by the breath and body heat of the sleepers. The temperature inside the canopy could be 5 to 10 degrees higher than in the rest of the house. It was the principle of a canopy, perfected for survival. They always slept together, huddled close to each other to combine the warmth of their bodies. The practice of sleeping together was not a matter of ethics or convenience, but a harsh necessity for survival. Parents and several older family members could sleep in one wide bed, warming each other with their backs. Loneliness on a cold night was dangerous, as the human body alone could hardly compensate for the loss of heat. Herd warmth worked just as effectively for humans as it did for wolves on the steppe. Sleepwear was also a well-thought-out part of the heat conservation system. No one slept naked. People wore long flannel nightshirts and nightcaps. The head loses a tremendous amount of heat, so leaving it uncovered meant freezing by morning. Nightcaps were pulled down over the ears and thick knitted wool socks were worn on the feet. Undressing before bed was a quick process so as not to get cold before getting under the covers. In the morning, the most difficult test was to climb out of this warm cocoon into the icy room. The water in the bucket by the door often froze overnight, reminding us of the temperature in the house. The difference in temperature under the blanket and in the room could cause real thermal shock. Therefore, clothes were placed directly under the blanket or on the edge of the bed in the evening, so that they would be warm when put on. The bed became the center of life during the harshest frosts, when it was dangerous to go outside. People could spend most of their time in bed, conserving energy and warmth. It was a time for storytelling, reading aloud, and planning for the future when the elements would recede. The bed was an ark floating through the icy storm of winter. This sleeping system seems cumbersome, but it was the only way to survive the night without central heating. Don't forget to like this if you feel like diving under a warm blanket right now. Guess what happened next when blankets weren't enough? Pioneers learned to use inertial heat sources that worked like modern hot water bottles, but were made of stone and metal. In harsh winters, when the walls of the house were frozen through, ordinary textiles were not enough for a comfortable sleep. Settlers had to find ways to preserve the heat of the hearth and transfer it to their icy bedrooms. This required ingenuity and the use of materials at hand that could maintain the temperature for a long time. The most common item used to heat beds was ordinary soapstone or flat river pebbles. This material was valued for its unique ability to absorb heat and release it very slowly. Soapstone was soft, easy to work with, and had a high heat capacity. These stones were placed on the edge of the hearth or in the oven in the evening, where they slowly heated up over several hours. It was important to ensure that the heating was gradual and uniform across the entire surface of the cobblestone. Heating too quickly could cause the stone to crack or split. The stone had to be hot, but not red hot, so as not to burn the linen or the skin. Checking the temperature was a mandatory procedure before using this natural heater. Housewives often dripped water on it. If the drop hissed and bounced off, it meant that the stone was overheated and needed to be cooled down. Before going to bed, the hot stone was wrapped in several layers of thick flannel or an old woolen towel. Wool served as an excellent insulator, which not only protected against burns, but also regulated heat transfer. This multi-layered wrapping allowed the stone to remain warm until morning. In addition to stones, heavy cast iron irons, which were usually used to iron laundry, were widely used. At that time, irons were solid pieces of metal without any electronics inside. They could weigh up to several kilograms, which made them ideal heat accumulators. The iron was heated on the stove, the handle was removed if it was removable, and it was also wrapped in thick fabric. Removable handles were a convenient invention, as they remained cool while the base heated up. But even if the handle was cast, thick fabric reliably protected the sleeper's feet from the hard metal. The massive sole plate of the iron had excellent heat capacity and did not cool down quickly under the quilt. Cast iron cooled even slower than stone, providing even and strong heat until dawn. During the day, this item was used to iron clothes, and at night it saved its owners from hypothermia. Sometimes old bricks were used, and which also accumulated heat from the hearth perfectly. Bricks made of fired clay were especially valued, as they did not crack from temperature changes. They were often used as a temporary replacement if a suitable stone was not at hand. The main rule was to carefully insulate the hot object from direct contact with the body and bedding. Any mistake could result in scorch marks or holes in the sheets. Bedding was expensive, and damaging it was considered a serious blow to the family budget. There were also special devices, copper or brass hot water bottles on long wooden handles. These were closed containers, similar to pans with lids, into which hot coals from the stove were poured. The metal heated up instantly, and the lid with holes allowed the heat to escape. The hostess would run such a warmer between the sheets, quickly drying and warming the bed before going to sleep. The long handle allowed her to reach the farthest corners of the bed without burning her hands. This had to be done quickly and energetically so as not to overheat one spot. However, the coals cooled quickly, and this method had only a short-term effect, unlike massive stones. In addition, there was a risk that a small spark would fly through the holes in the lid directly onto the mattress. Therefore, such hot water bottles were used only for preheating and were not left in bed overnight. Copper hot water bottles were a luxury item and a source of pride, brought from the East as a family heirloom. They were often decorated with embossing and hung in a prominent place in the house to demonstrate the family status. Poor settlers could rarely afford such a thing and made do with whatever they had at hand. Another unexpected source of heat was ordinary potatoes baked in their skins. Large potatoes were baked in ashes until ready, and then, while still hot, were placed in the pockets of nightclothes or socks. This was a popular method among children and travelers who needed to warm their hands. Potatoes, thanks to their high water content, retained heat for a long time and warmed hands or feet. The starchy structure of the vegetable acted as an excellent heat insulator, releasing heat very gradually. This allowed potatoes to be used as miniature and safe hot water bottles. In the morning, these same potatoes, now cooled but not frozen, were eaten for breakfast. The pioneers did not throw anything away, and the food that had served as a source of heat at night provided energy for work in the morning. It was a waste-free production of heat and food, ingenious in its simplicity. Sometimes they used bags of grain, cherry pits, or sand, which were also heated in the oven. Cherry pits were especially popular because they retained air inside, which kept the temperature for a long time. Such fillers were light and accessible to every household. Without an additional source of heat for the feet, it was almost impossible to fall asleep in such cold weather. The human body is designed in such a way that when the limbs freeze, it goes into alarm mode and cannot fall asleep. Warm feet sent a signal to the brain that everything was fine and it was okay to sleep. People fell asleep feeling the warmth of the stones through layers of wool. This feeling created an illusion of safety and protection from the hostile outside world. Even the poorest families tried to provide themselves with this minimal comfort. In the morning, the cooled stones were returned to the hearth to wait for the next evening. During the day, they lay in the warmth, accumulating the energy of the fire to give it back to people at night. This cycle was an integral part of the winter life of the pioneers. They turned black from soot and time, but this did not diminish their value. On the contrary, an old proven stone was valued more than a new one, as its properties were already well known to its owners. It was cherished and cared for so as not to break it when carrying it. Every home had its own set of nightstones that served faithfully for years. These simple objects were passed down from older to younger generations until more modern methods of heating appeared. Do you use a hot water bottle on cold nights? In log houses, which were built where there were forests, the main enemy was the gaps between the logs. Wood is a living material. It dries out, deforms, and moves, opening the way for icy winds. The process of sealing these gaps was called caulking, and it was a never-ending battle for the airtightness of the dwelling. A mixture of clay, sand, and straw was used to fill the gaps between the logs from the outside and inside. This putty dried out, cracked, and fell out, requiring constant repair and renewal every season. Any materials that could plug the hole were used: moss, old rags, wool, and even newspapers. Moss was an excellent natural antiseptic and insulator. It did not rot and held its shape well in the gaps. It was collected in swamps and forests, dried, and tightly packed into the grooves with wooden wedges. If moss was not available, a clay solution mixed with animal wool was used as a binder. In winter, the gaps were often checked with a lit candle, running it along the walls. If the flame flickered or deviated, it meant that there was a draft in that place, which had to be eliminated immediately. Even a small gap could cool down a house in a few hours in strong winds. People literally plugged up the house from the inside, fighting invisible currents of cold air. Floors were also a source of cold, as they often consisted of roughly fitted boards with gaps. For the winter, the floors were covered with thick woven rugs, skins, or simply a layer of straw. This created an additional insulating layer and protected the feet from drafts from under the floor. Fabric bolsters or sandbags were placed along the walls at floor level to block the cold air. Doors and windows were the most vulnerable places in the house's defense against the cold. For the winter, often only one entrance was left open, while the other doors were tightly sealed and insulated. The front door was covered with felt or leather, and the doorway was hung with a heavy blanket. The windows were closed with shutters on the outside and stuffed with pillows or bags of straw on the inside. Outside the house, they often made a zabalka, a mound of earth or snow along the lower crowns of the log house. Strangely enough, snow was an excellent insulator, protecting the foundation and floor from freezing. Pioneers deliberately piled snowdrifts against the walls of the house, creating an additional snow coat. The more snow there was around the house, the warmer it was inside. The attic, if there was one, was filled with hay or dry leaves, creating a thick cushion above the living quarters. Heat rises, and without reliable ceiling insulation, it would simply escape into the sky. A thick layer of hay in the attic worked just as well as modern insulation. However, mice often took up residence there, and a separate war had to be waged against them. Fighting drafts was a daily routine, a matter of life and death. One unnoticed hole could lead to the house becoming deadly cold by morning. Attention to detail and constant repairs were the price of relative comfort. The house required constant human involvement to remain livable. A perfectly sealed house was an unattainable dream, but everyone strove for this ideal. Layers of clay, moss, and rags told the story of this family's struggle for warmth. The walls of the house were a chronicle of their labor and perseverance. Caulking was dirty and hard work, but it determined how the winter would go. Men, women, and teenagers worked together to knead clay and fill in the cracks. It was a shared task that united the family in the face of a common threat. Ready to learn the secret that saved the lives of thousands of people? Clothing on the frontier was not divided into home and streetwear in the modern sense. It was multi-layered armor. The main material was wool, which has the unique property of keeping you warm even when wet. Pioneers wore woolen underwear, which they hardly ever took off throughout the winter. This second skin was itchy and rough, but it created an air layer around the body, trapping heat. Flannel shirts, sheepskin vests, and thick woolen pants or skirts were worn over the underwear. Women wore several petticoats at once, creating a dome of warm air around their legs. Men often wore leather pants over woolen ones, as leather did not let the wind through. The principle of layering allowed them to regulate their body temperature by removing or adding clothing as needed. The air between the layers of clothing acted as the best insulator. Footwear was critically important, as the feet were the first to freeze and the most severely. They wore buffalo leather moccasins with fur inserts or heavy leather boots. The boots were stuffed with dry grass or straw for extra insulation and moisture absorption. If the feet got wet, they had to be dried immediately. Otherwise, frostbite would set in within minutes. Greasing the shoes made them waterproof, but reduced the breathability of the leather. Outerwear was often made from bison or bear skins, with the fur facing in or out depending on the weather. A bison coat was incredibly heavy, but it protected against any wind and frost. Such coats were passed down from generation to generation and were valued more than gold. Those who did not have skins wore coats made of thick cloth, lined with cotton or wool. Collars were turned up high to protect the face from the wind. Hands were protected with mittens rather than gloves, as fingers kept each other warm when they were together. Mittens were made of leather and fur, often very long to cover the wrists. Long woolen scarves were wrapped around the neck and could also be used to cover the face. Protecting the face was important to prevent frostbite on the nose and cheeks in the wind. Clothes were constantly mended, patch upon patch, as new fabric was expensive and rare. Each layer of clothing had its own history and purpose in the thermoregulation system. Darning and sewing were the main occupations of women during the long winter evenings. Worn-out adult clothing was re-sewn for younger children until the fabric finally fell apart. Washing in winter was a rare and difficult task, as there was nowhere to dry the laundry. Therefore, woolen items were simply aired out in the cold or scorched over the stove. The smell of smoke and sweat was a constant companion, but no one paid any attention to it. hygiene took a backseat to the task of staying warm. The ability to dress properly was a skill that was learned from childhood. It was impossible to sweat, as moisture in the cold was deadly. If a person felt overheated while working, they had to unbutton or remove a layer. Controlling body moisture was the key to survival. Wool was prickly, heavy, and smelled like sheep, but it was the only salvation. Cotton was called death because it cooled the body when wet. People trusted only natural animal materials. What part of the pioneer's wardrobe do you think was the most indispensable? Controlling the fire in the stove or fireplace was a real art, on which the family's waking up in the morning depended. The main task was not just to heat the house, but to keep the coals hot until morning. This process was called banking the fire. Before going to bed, large coals were raked into a pile deep in the hearth and covered with a thick layer of ash. The ash blocked the oxygen supply, causing the coals to smolder slowly, but not go out completely. This pile of ash acted like a thermos, retaining the heat inside for 8 to 10 hours. In the morning, the housewife simply had to rake the ashes, put some dry kindling on top, and fan the coals. If the fire went out, it was a disaster, as it was painfully long to rekindle it with frozen hands, striking a spark with flint. Stoves were usually placed in the center of the room so that the heat would spread evenly in all directions. The chimney passed through the entire room, giving off additional heat to the air before the smoke escaped outside. Often, shelves were placed on the chimney to dry clothes or shoes. Fireplaces were less efficient, as most of the heat escaped up the chimney, so cast iron stoves were preferred. During severe frosts, the stove was heated around the clock, with family members taking turns to keep watch. Someone had to wake up every 2 hours to add fuel and check the draft. If the chimney was clogged with snow or soot, carbon monoxide could kill the sleepers unnoticed. It was a silent killer that was feared more than the cold. The color of the flame spoke volumes. A blue flame meant high temperature and clean combustion, while a yellow flame meant a lack of oxygen. An experienced eye could determine the condition of the stove with a single glance at the damper. The draft was regulated very precisely so that the fuel burned as slowly as possible without going out. Saving firewood or dung was an obsession. Ash from the stove was never thrown away. It was used to make soap or as insulation. A bucket of hot ashes could be left in the room as an additional source of heat, with caution. It was a dangerous but effective method of raising the temperature by a couple of degrees. The stove was the heart of the home, its only living organ, requiring nourishment and care. All of life revolved around it: cooking, eating, washing, and working. The place by the stove was the most honorable and desirable for anyone entering. The ability to quickly start a fire from damp materials was valued more highly than literacy. Everyone knew which wood gave off more heat and which only smoked. Birch burned hot and fast, oak slowly and long. But on the plains, there was no choice. In the morning, when the fire was rekindled, the house began to come to life. The sound of crackling fuel and the smell of smoke were signals of the beginning of a new day of struggle. Fire was a symbol of life conquering icy death. Without a reliable stove and a supply of fuel, even the strongest house became nothing more than a cold tomb. The pioneers intuitively understood that the human body is also a stove that needs to be heated from within. To generate heat, the body needed a huge amount of calories, especially fats. The winter diet on the frontier was radically different from the summer diet in its heaviness and fat content. People ate lard, melted fat, fatty pork, and anything else that could provide energy for heating. Breakfast began with a hearty, fatty meal: fried meat, eggs on lard, and pancakes soaked in oil. This was necessary to kickstart the metabolism and give strength to work in the cold. It was believed that you couldn't go out into the cold on an empty stomach. You would freeze instantly. Food was an internal shield from the external environment. Pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries, occupied a special place in the diet. It was a concentrated source of energy that could be carried in your pocket and eaten on the go. A piece of pemmican provided as much energy as a full meal and took a long time to digest, warming you from the inside. Pemmican was adopted from the Native Americans and adapted to suit their needs. Hot drinks were consumed by the leader: weak coffee, herbal teas, or just boiling water. The main thing was not the content, but the temperature of the liquid, which warmed the esophagus and stomach. A mug of hot water could bring a frozen person back to life faster than rubbing. Sugar and molasses were also used as sources of quick energy. Sweets were rare, but their consumption increased in winter. Molasses was added to porridge, spread on bread, and mixed with fat. It was fast-burning fuel for emergencies. People gained weight by winter, and this was considered a sign of health and good preparation. A layer of subcutaneous fat acted as natural insulation, helping to keep the organs warm. Being thin in winter was dangerous to life. Lunch was substantial, but dinner was made as filling as possible to provide enough warmth for the whole night. Digestion raises body temperature, so going to bed hungry was a bad idea. People ate stewed beans with bacon and thick meat soups. Hunting in winter provided fresh meat, which was richer in vitamins and fats than salted meat. Deer or bison were coveted prey, providing families with high-quality fuel. The liver and heart were eaten immediately, as it was believed that they gave special strength and warmth. A lack of fat in the diet led to rapid fatigue and an inability to withstand the cold. Fat starvation was a real threat to those who had run out of supplies. People literally felt the cold penetrating their bodies if they did not eat heartily. Food was not a pleasure, but a means of survival, a tool like an axe or a gun. Waking up in a pioneer's house in winter was a shocking experience that required willpower. The first thing a person saw when they opened their eyes was often frost on the nail heads, in the walls, or even on the blanket near their face. The steam from their breath during the night settled on objects and froze, covering the room with a thin layer of white frost. Getting out of a warm bed into this cold was physically painful. The water in the bucket by the door froze to the bottom, turning into a solid block. The hostess had to break the ice with an axe or put the bucket on the stove to get some water for washing. Toothbrushes and wet towels stood stiff as a board, hard as stone. Any liquid left away from the fire turned to ice by morning. Clothes taken off in the evening were icy to the touch and had to be put on with gritted teeth. Movements were quick and sharp to get the blood flowing and warm up while getting dressed. No one lingered in bed. The day began with a rush. The first thing to do was to revive the stove, fan the coals, and throw on some kindling. Until the fire was lit, the house was dead silent and cold. Smoke began to rise from the chimney, and this was a sign to the neighbors that the family had survived another night. The windows were covered with thick patterns of ice on the inside, through which nothing could be seen. To look outside, you had to breathe on the ice crust or heat a coin and press it against the glass. There was little light in the house, and the morning began in semi-darkness. Breakfast was prepared in coats and hats until the stove warmed the air at least a little. Steam rose from people's mouths right in the kitchen, mixing with the steam from the pots. Metal objects, spoons, door handles, burned your fingers with cold, and you could stick to them with wet skin. The livestock in the barn also required attention. The ice in the troughs had to be broken and feed had to be given. The animals suffered from the cold no less than the people, and caring for them was a priority. Often, newborn calves or lambs were brought into the house near the stove so that they would not freeze to death. The doorstep was often covered with snow so that the door could not be opened. We had to climb out through the window or dig a tunnel to get out into the yard. Digging out the house was a regular morning exercise after a snowstorm. Despite all the difficulties, morning was a time of hope. The sun rose over the snowy plain, promising a warmer day. People drank hot coffee, warmed their hands on mugs, and prepared for new tasks. The routine of survival continued day after day until spring. Paradoxically, heavy snowfalls often became a salvation rather than a curse for the inhabitants of dugouts. When a house was completely covered with snow, it turned into a giant snowdrift with a chimney. Snow is an excellent insulator, consisting mainly of air. A layer of snow 1.5 meters thick completely blocked the wind and kept the heat inside the house. The pioneers knew this principle well and did not rush to completely clear the roofs and walls of snow. They dug narrow tunnels from the door to the outbuildings, creating a labyrinth under the snow. These tunnels were also quieter and warmer than in the open wind. Life went on under the snow in the thick white blanket. However, there was a danger that the snow would block the chimney, and then the family could suffocate. Therefore, the pipe was often extended or regularly cleaned with a long stick. It was the only point of contact with the outside world, which had to be kept open at all costs. Light hardly penetrated the snow-covered house, and people lived in constant twilight. This weighed on the psyche, causing what was called cabin fever. The feeling of confinement and isolation could drive one mad, so communication and work were important for mental health. Inside the snow cocoon, outside sounds were muffled, creating a cotton-like silence. There was no howling wind, only the occasional crackling of settling snow. This created an illusion of safety, of being cut off from the raging elements. Animals also used snow to survive. Horses turned their tails to the wind and let the snow cover them. Wild animals buried themselves in snowdrifts. People copied this tactic, allowing winter to cover their homes. In the spring, the melting of this massive snow became a problem, threatening to flood the dugout. But in winter, every centimeter of snow cover on the roof meant saved firewood and an extra degree of warmth inside. Snow was free insulation, a gift from nature itself. The isolation could last for months, cutting the farm off from the nearest town or neighbors. Food and fuel supplies had to be calculated with a margin for such blockades. No one could come to the rescue if something happened. The ability to wait and endure was the main quality of a pioneer. Sitting in the warmth under tons of snow, listening to the crackling of the fire, and knowing that you had outsmarted winter was their small victory. Life under the snow was a form of hibernation, a slowing down of the rhythm of life for the sake of its preservation. We see that survival on the frontier was a complex science, woven from thousands of little things, from the thickness of the walls to the amount of fat in the dinner. Everything mattered in the fight against the cold. Pioneers did not conquer nature. They learned to adapt to it, using its own laws for their protection. Their homes, their clothes, and their habits were a response to the extreme conditions in which they found themselves. Today, sitting in warm apartments with central heating, it is difficult for us to imagine the degree of endurance and ingenuity that was required for a simple overnight stay. But it was this resilience that shaped the character of the people who settled the Wild West. Which of these survival methods did you find most surprising? Could you sleep with a hot stone at your feet while listening to the howling wind? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel to learn more about real stories of survival in the past.